Well, thank you very much for that introduction there, President. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming out tonight during the school holidays and to listen to my short talk. It's an honour to be here. I've come with my mother and my sister, and I appreciate your interest in this topic because, as you've heard, my life started here in Adelaide. I wanted to, when I grew up, be an officer in the army. I think I decided at the age of 12, so off I went to the Royal Military College Junction at the age of 17 and waved goodbye to my mother, and that was the end of me. I sometimes say that to my children now when they like to move out of home and go off, but as you probably know, a lot of them stay home. That started a 24-year career in the army. I was a young lieutenant in the Royal Australian Regiment. I served in Malaysia as a young platoon commander. I finished up in the Special Air Service Regiment, and there I was a free-fall parachute instructor, so my knees and ankles were a little touchy. I commanded our first counter-terrorist force in the SAS in 1980 after a period of time in the UK, around the time of the Prince's Gate siege. And later I went on to command a commando company and then a commando regiment, and ended my military career as the commander of our peacekeeping troops in the Middle East in the Sinai, where you may not know we're part of a 3,500 man force that keeps the peace between Israel and Egypt. It's about the only peace in the Middle East at the moment that's holding, and I'll talk about that later on. But it meant that I lived in Egypt and Israel. I was not far from Gaza, a little fortified location called El Gora, across the border of Rafah, where all the bombing's going on all the time. I know the area and the people very well, and I'll talk about that later. I came back and went into business, and every Special Forces officer, when he leaves, opens a few childcare centres, which is what I did, thanks to my mother, who was in the industry. So I found myself, when I first went into Parliament, they tagged me as the kindergarten cop, and I went into business for a period of time, and then went in as a member for Wake, which is the Mitcham area in the South Australian Parliament, in 1997, and served for 22 years as an MP. In that time, I was a minister in the Kerry government for tourism innovation and a couple of other portfolios. I was leader of the opposition, the Liberal opposition, for a period of time, and I eventually, for reasons I'll explain, resigned from the Liberal Party, became an independent Conservative, and was offered a job with the Labor government as an independent Conservative minister, which I did, as the Minister for Defence Industries, Trade Investment, Small Business, Space, Medical Technology, various other things, from 2014 to 2018, and I retired from Parliament in 2018. Now, I just mention all that because I just want you to know the perspectives I'm going to share with you tonight about what I think is going wrong with democracy and what the South Australian story tells us in part of that greater global story comes from the viewpoint of someone who's been a soldier, a business person, and then a member of Parliament. So I have a mixed bag of experiences that have drawn me to the conclusions that I will share with you tonight. Now, I've written a book about my time in Parliament. It's called 7 Leaders in Camelot. You might remember Mike Rand used to run around saying Adelaide was Camelot on the Times. And it's really a story about the 6 premiers I worked with, starting with Dean Brown, John Olsen, Rob Kerrin, then I go to Mike Rand, then I go to Joe Weatherall, and then Stephen Marshall. And I'm the 7th leader, the least successful. I got the dizzy heights of leader of the opposition. But I segue my story into it. And the reason I wrote this book is I started off thinking I'll write a political memoir, and then I thought no one's going to read that. I thought I'll actually write about the rise and fall of the premiers I worked with. And that's what's in the book. And I think for any of you who are political junkies or just interested in state history, it's worth a read. Not enough is written about state politics. And one of the points I want to make to you tonight is that what's been going on in South Australia for the last 30 or 40 years has also been going on in Westphalia and in Bavaria, in the German democracy. It's been going on in the south of France and in the suburbs of Paris. It's been going on in the United States, all over that country. It's been going on in the UK. It's Basically a story about local electors going along and electing their local politicians to represent them, whether they're in a federation like Germany, which is very much like us, or a union like the UK and New Zealand. All the qualities, all the attributes, the successes and failure of leaders, all of the dynamics is exactly the same. And I can tell you there was plenty of cut and thrust and tragedy during the 22 years I spent in state politics. It was all there. The backstabbing, the sniping, the highs, the lows, the tears, the laughter, the grand achievements and the miserable failures. In fact, if this story had taken place in Washington or London, there would be a Netflix drama and everyone would be watching it. If it had happened in Adelaide, so a lot of the colour and mood has been missed. But you'll see similarities and rhymes in what happened here with what's happening around the world. And that's quite concerning, because I think Western democracy, arguably, is going wrong. And if we're not careful, if we don't look after it, we may lose it. And the alternatives are pretty scary. But I'll come back to that. World democracy really needs a bit of a health check. I mean, just think about Britain for a minute. You know, we had, how many prime ministers have we had? Although as an Australian, I'm very cautious to throw that out there, because I remember sitting when I was Minister for Trade and Investment, I sat at a banquet with very senior government officials from China, and I was lecturing them about how wonderful Australia is, and the senior governor I was talking to said to me, how many prime ministers have you had again, Martin, in the last 4 years? And it was right in the middle of the whole sort of Howard, Rudd, Gillard, you know, and Abbott, Turnbull, shut me up immediately. But Britain's been through it as well. Cameron, Theresa May, Boris Johnson turned the world upside down. Rishi Sunak tried to sort it out. Now we've got Keir Starmer, whose wife apparently likes very expensive clothes. Those of you who haven't read about that, it was all about service, but apparently they've had quite a few gifts in the very short time he's been the Prime Minister. So he's learning swiftly that you get a lot more scrutiny as Prime Minister than you do as opposition leader. And we've had Brexit. Brexit versus the EU, really. It's been a rebellion. We don't like the EU anymore. We're leaving. Remember, the EU, a lot of these international structures were democratic structures, but these international structures, democracies are leaving them. I'll come back to that point. The Americans recently said that the British Shore Defence Force is no longer a Tier 1 Defence Force, it's not even a Tier 2 Defence Force, like France. You're a Tier 3. You're down there with, you know, all the little countries. So it's not the British Defence Force at the Battle of Britain. In some respects, it's a country in decline. It's got some serious issues with its democracy, and a lot of you have seen that play out in the media. Europe has got its own problems. The rise of the extreme right, Le Pen in France, Germany and Russia, Hungary and Poland, Austria recently electing extreme right government, which left commentators love to describe these movements of the right as extreme right. It's like the Nazis are coming back. When you really look at it, they're ultra-conservative parties, but I don't think they're Nazi parties at all. But there's this sort of European inability to move on from World War II, and the minute any conservative voice emerges, they immediately get characterised as throwing back to the Nazis and sort of Mussolini, which is not really true. It's more of a response to change being reflected in the political dynamics of Europe. And it is moving to the right. And it's moving to the right for reasons that the majority, a lot of people in Europe think are the right reasons. Then you've got the USA. Let's make America great again. Donald Trump. Of course we had Biden, and we've had the whole circus, the left and right, the polarisation of politics. I remember myself when I went into the South Australian Parliament in '97. There was quite a lot of collegiality. There was a lot of friendships formed across the chamber. Most of the time it was fairly friendly. There was a lot of cooperation, particularly working on bills and legislation. I'd say about 90% of the time it was cooperation, about 10% of the time it was an all-in barroom brawl. Usually during question time and the cameras were there so that everyone could impress their constituents. But When I left the Parliament in 2018, I'd say it was about 50-50. Fewer relationships across the chamber, a lot more acrimony, more division. And you're certainly seeing that in the United States. Donald Trump's taken the Republican Party far to the right. They've extinguished their moderate wing almost, or silenced it. And the Democrats, similarly, are moving to the left and seem to have extinguished a lot of their more conservative wings, because these parties have factions that don't agree with each other, and I'll come back to that point. So democracy is going crazy around the world, and people are asking questions about its survivability. The Greeks had democracy, it didn't last for long. The Romans tried it as well, they had a wonderful democracy. Pick up your history books and read about how the Romans fell into dictatorship, as with the Greeks. Sit down with your grandkids and watch Star Wars. The Republic somehow becomes an evil empire, complete with Darth Vaders. And interesting, the politics of the decline from democracy into autocracy. And there's certainly pressures there. I'll come back to that. And part of that dynamic change is a movement away from multilateral organisations that link democracies together. NATO, you've got the Americans turning around saying, you know what, I don't think we'll stay in NATO, you're not paying me way. So others saying, we want to join, like the Ukrainians are very keen to join. Some of the Scandinavians just joined, but others are questioning the UN. A lot of people are getting very ambivalent about the UN. I saw the UN at work in the Middle East, and it wasn't very impressive, let me tell you, and also in the Balkans. I know soldiers, I have colleagues who are under fire in the Balkans, ringing up for support from New York, and they've got an answering service that said, our office opens at 9 a.m, please call back in business hours. And there was a war going on, and they were involved in it. The UN in many ways is an extremely unprofessional organisation, funded by democracies. You probably heard in the media reports, some of the people involved in the October 7 attacks on Israelis that started the current fracas were employees of the UN, and even a Hamas official that just got blown to pieces in Beirut was an employee of the UN. How can this be? How can it be that these multilateral structures are falling apart? So is Western civilisation under challenge? I don't think there's any doubt of that. And why would that be? There's a lack of faith in parliamentarians and politicians. We love to be cynical. In some countries, living under the jackboot, they'd just like to have a parliament and some politicians. But we're in this luxurious situation where we can sit back and scoff and dismiss and be cynical about our politicians and our parliaments, and our politicians and our parliaments sometimes invite that criticism because they're not perfect. But it's an interesting phenomenon. But at the same time, we criticise our politicians and our parliamentarianship. We increasingly seem to want governments, or we certainly allow them to increasingly run our lives. There's a problem. We want a new law about it. I lost count when I was an MP, the number of groups, stakeholder groups, came to see me demanding that there be a law for this or that. Usually it was a business association wanting to block competitors, keep someone else out of their market, get government to set up some sort of a barrier. But I must say I was surprised from time to time as a member of Parliament how compliant we Australians are, how happy we are for the government to have a law to tell us what we can and can't do. And I'll come back to that thing. In some countries, they don't. Well, look at the gun debate in America. They're not going to have the government tell them whether they can carry guns or not. They'll make their own mind up. The French during COVID, there was World War III on the streets. We seem to just go along with it all. We're very compliant. So we complain about politicians and governments. We're quite happy to, have them run our lives. I'll come back to that. We aren't sure about what parties stand for. The whole idea of the left and the right, this acute polarisation, it's all a bit woolly. What's the difference between the Labor Party and the Liberal Party? If I ask you to pull out a bit of paper and write down 5 points of difference between the Labor and the Liberal Party, I wonder what your answers would be. Sometimes you can't spot the difference. You cannot spot the difference. They pretend that they're different, but how different really are they really? There's a lack of faith in general, a movement away from religion, but what else will replace that? And there's a real question about whether religion is a fundamental building block in Western civilisation. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the birth of Western civilisation had quite a lot to do with faith. It's not a conversation. The number of people that identify as people of faith in Australia is just slight, and around the Western world is skyrocketing downwards. And is that part of the reason why Western civilisation is losing its way? Are we getting leaders, or are we getting people who look at a poll, decide what they think people want, and then just do it? Who's leading? And is that a good thing or a bad thing? We want people to listen to us, but every now and then we want a Thatcher, or we want a Paul Keating. We want someone to get up, or we want a John Howard to get up and say something like, we're going to have a GST, and these are the reasons why. I know you don't like it, but you know, and to persuade, encourage, convince us to that view. We don't seem to get quite as much as that as we once did, or as we could. In some democracies, though, religion's making a comeback. There's certainly an outburst of extreme Islam at the moment, driving Middle East politics. We've got whole states where they've done away with democracy and turned it into Islamic states, where their Bible, the Quran, is the book of law for the nation, and they don't have a legal code, they just read from the Quran. That's interesting. Imagine if that happened here. Imagine if we just did away with the laws of the land, we just said, look, we'll use the Bible, thanks, as our legal code, and we appointed religious people to, you know, that's effectively what's happened. And in other parts of the Western democratic world, particularly take India, Hindu nationalism is a very important part of their democracy, as it is shaped at the moment, particularly with the BJP. So in some democracies, religion's pretty important. Doesn't seem that important in Western democracies like Australia, United States and Europe. Although you can see Donald Trump and others in Europe trying to re-energise that. And it's been very interesting watching the Christian world in the United States get behind Donald Trump, which you might find a contradiction when you look at Donald Trump's behaviour from time to time. However, he is putting policies to the Christian world in America that they feel inclined to vote for. That's an interesting phenomenon. We no longer believe the media. We don't think they're telling us the truth. We think we'll outsmart the media, we'll get on social media, and we'll find out the truth, won't we, on social media, until we find out that half the people feeding us nonsense on social media aren't telling us the truth either. Everybody's got a finger in every pie. So maybe the mainstream media aren't so bad after all. At least they have standards of journalism. Maybe there's truth there. There's not much truth in social media. All of it's very confusing. We don't really know the true story anymore. There's such a diaspora of information inputs, we're a bit lost. Then we've lost faith in our institutions. We used to respect the church a great deal until we found out about a long legacy of sexual abuse and other transgressions by the church. And all of them, not just one or two. Turns out they were institutions and organisations just like others that were fallible and attracted people who were flawed. That's perhaps helped a movement away from the church. We used to trust the banks. Then we had the Banking Royal Commission and found out what they were really doing to us. We used to trust Qantas. It used to be one of the most protected brands and loved brands in the country. Good luck with that one. Woolies and Coles, Australian institutions, not anymore. The police, the Australian Defence Force. I work in Veterans Affairs. We've had allegations made about possible war crimes involving a handful of people, 25 people of the 26,000 young Australians who served there. Only one bloke's been charged. It may be there's not a single conviction. It may be there's not been a single war crime committed, but you wouldn't know that from what you've been reading. It's all wonderful, isn't it? Built into pieces, the institutions of our nation, until no one knows who or what to trust anymore. We don't seem to celebrate or recognise the flag very much, or the national anthem, perhaps, except at sporting fixtures. The tradition of Anzac. We can't even agree on Australia Day. There's people running around telling us Invasion Day. No respect for the pioneers and the early, the people that came out here with nothing and made this country what it is today, are to be trashed and disrespected as invaders because another group has a different view of that experience. Fine. But somehow we can't share those two stories and meld them together. And the result is, well, we just won't have Australia Day. Now, what replaces these institutions that we've thrown out the window? Is it affluence? Is it materialism? Influences, perhaps. The cult of celebrity. Everyone wants to be a celebrity now. Even parenting, education, family values are increasingly dominated and determined by the state through legislation. And those values have become bullied. Is free debate now unreasonably constrained by rules about diversity, defamation, discrimination, in a world where it may be an offence to offend someone, just to offend them by speaking plainly? The right to go up and say, I don't like you because... There we go. Can you still hear me? Yes. Yeah, I don't like you because I don't like the fact you're wearing pink socks, or I don't like those bunny ears you're wearing. Suddenly offending someone can become a crime. Why would we accept this? And what has it done to change our approach to our democracy in the world we live in? Drugs and family breakdown, from my experience as a lawmaker, are the two things that are ripping the country to pieces. The effect drugs are having, there wouldn't be a family in this room, there wouldn't be a person in this room who's somewhere in your extended family hasn't got someone who's been touched by the drugs or family breakdown. And we wonder why there is such an outbreak of lawlessness and so many people in jail or offending. And the goalposts about what a family is and what it is not are also moving. In democracy, the family is the basic building block. It is the first brick in the wall. But the concept of what a family is has changed so swiftly and so dramatically. Some people think that's fantastic. Some people have been a bit left behind by it. And it's left a lot of people, young and old, scratching their head and thinking, well, what is a family? And the end of history, remember that? When the Berlin Wall came down and the Russian USSR collapsed, it was all over. We could stop spending on defence anymore. We could forget about future conflict. It was the end of history. There would be no more conflict. Peace, freedom and love would flow around the world forevermore. You remember those conversations back then in the 1990s? If anyone watched the news tonight, it hasn't quite worked out that way. The end of history is over. The USSR is back. The Russian Empire is back. War and conflict from the Atlantic to the Pacific through the Levant, as far as the eye can see. And racism and religious zealotry are presented to us in the form of legislation seeking to discriminate and advantage in the Constitution one race over the other, which was our recent referendum. On the basis of race alone, there would be an advantage. I mean, once we go down that road, and Australians rejected that, other laws are being changed to do with religious freedoms, seeking to enshrine religious freedoms, could have the exact opposite effect. So, democratic states and local communities then are feeling threatened by migration. We've had it here with the boat people turning back the boats. It was a national ethic. Now it's happening in Europe. This flood of people flying around, and of course, you look at Trump. Build the wall. Communities are feeling threatened by migration, by the scale of it. Now, it's one thing for Australia and Canada and the United States that are relatively young countries and multicultural countries, and that were created largely, apart from the indigenous people who were overrun when we all came, by a mixed match of people from all different parts of the world. It doesn't quite work that well in countries like France or Austria or Germany or Greece, where they have traditions going back centuries and millennia. And suddenly you have all these foreigners coming in and taking over and breaking things up and causing dislocation. There's a huge kickback about that. Now, that is where there is a connection between the anti-migration movement in Europe and what Adolf Hitler was saying. He wanted a pure Caucasian Europe. And there is a connection there. And we need to think carefully about that and worry about that, because if a country with cultural depth and achievement and history of Germany can fall into the hands of the Nazis in the 1930s, then it can happen to any single one of us. It can happen to any democracy you like. If it can happen in Germany, it can happen anywhere. And remember, he was elected. I think the vote was something like 96% in the end. It didn't end well. So, I guess the argument I'm making is, are we taking our democracy for granted? There's a lot of things going on, and I've run over a few. So what does it all mean for democracy? Because if they don't cope, there are alternatives to democracy. And some of them, like China, are delivering amazing economic prosperity. I went there 4 times a year when I was Minister of Trade and Investment. It's extraordinary. You can't argue the case that China hasn't achieved a miracle. In the 1960s, they were starving to death. China is now on its march to be the biggest and most powerful economy the world has ever seen. They have lifted tens of millions of people out of poverty, gone from being a country, a third world nation, to one of the mightiest nations on earth. No democracy involved in that. They did it through complete autocracy under a communist government. It's been a miracle. And a lot of countries are looking at that and thinking, well, maybe we can do that too. Why do we need democracy in order to be economically successful? And it is a very powerful argument. A very powerful argument. When they want to build a road in China, it doesn't go on ABC Morning so everyone can ring up and have a complaint about it. Everyone doesn't get to put their chip in about, watching that. We don't have it too. And then we'll have 5 votes in Parliament, 10 parliamentary committees, and let's see if in 3 years' time we build the road. I went to the UAE. I was the Shadow Minister for Energy, and I went and visited a brand new power station. I said, how long did it take you to get the approvals to build this power station? He said, 3 months. Go to the Middle East and look at development rising up out of the sand. We've got a housing crisis at the moment. One of the reasons is no one can get approval to build houses. No housing crisis in China. In fact, they got the other problem. They're knocking them down. They've got so many. So people are looking at the alternative, thinking, well, it's working for them. So what lays in wait for us in our democracy? You know, you get the dystopian movies on Netflix, this sort of Taliban world, you know, this strange sort of a futuristic world where democracy's gone and we're under some sort of autocratic future. Some living in democracies really don't really care about having a democracy. Kids were asked recently, how important do you think it is that you live in a democracy? Nearly 50% of them said they didn't think it affected their lives. Or it would have no effect or consequence for us. I think was particularly the answer. The very freedoms we cherish and which make us liberal and accepting are leading us to question Western civilisation, its worth and its value. This sentiment and the collapse of the Australian dream of owning your own home on a quarter-acre block with 2 to 3 kids and a job that allows you to take a holiday once a year permeates the younger generations of Australians who fundamentally feel betrayed and lied to by their parents. Conversely, older generations of Australians, particularly those from the post-Second World War baby boom, probably includes a lot of us here, and what can inexcusably be described as the golden age of Western civilisation, confront these younger generations as entitled, spoiled, and uninterested in continuing the civilisation. Is democracy and Western civilisation worth defending? Would we fight to protect it like we did in World War I and World War II? Many on Australian university campuses on the streets think so, others do not. Research conducted by the IPR, some of you may have read this in the paper, revealed recently that across all age groups, less than half of Australians said they would defend their nation, with a growing number saying they would rather flee if there was a war, which when broken down further, 46% of Australians would stay and fight while 30% would leave, with 24% not sure of their next steps. I'm not sure if they were thinking they'd flee on their own, perhaps leave mum and dad and their children behind, or whether they just didn't think Australia was worth fighting for. Breaking this data down on key demographics, specifically 18 to 24, 25 to 34 and 35 to 44 age groups, we see that in the case of the first group, only 27%, that's a 5-point drop since 2022, so just in 2 years, it's dropped by that much, would stay and fight. While in the 25 to 34 age group it was 42%, and in the 35 to 44 demographic, 48%, under half. The older you get, the more you've got at stake and the more reason to stay and defend it. Where things get really concerning, however, is when those same demographics are asked if they would leave. Up to 48% of the 18 to 24-year-old group said they would leave the country rather than fight. And so it goes on. Nearly half young Australians don't think Australia is worth fighting for. I work in Veterans Affairs, deal a lot with Afghanistan veterans, many of whom were wounded in that war, and we had 41 Australians killed there. And trying to explain this to them is a very difficult thing. It's a long cry from the Cooee marches of World War I and the response to defend the nation in World War II, when despite vibrant conscription debates, our forebears flocked to the flag and answered the call. Australia has changed, and our commitment to our democracy, and whether it's worth fighting for, has changed with it. Now let's get back to South Australia, because it's a lovely case study, as I've mentioned, on the challenges facing Western civilisation and democracy. I thought that I should write something down when I left. What I noticed when I went into politics, there was no book I could go to that told me what had happened in the 20 years before I got there. I had to work out, and I was in the Liberal Party, I had to try and work out the history of the Liberal Party and what made it tick, it took me years, right? It was like going to a foreign planet and trying to understand how all the minds worked and what were the histories, the personal histories, the personal connections, the political connections, so on and so forth. And look, after I'd spent 22 years working it out, I thought I had to write it down so everyone else understood. A Liberal government, and I'll talk about Labor in a minute too, but a Liberal government here, led by a Conservative, because the parties have different factions. I've got a Conservative faction and a little radical left-wing faction, right? If you've got a Conservative running the Liberal Party, the same John Olsen, you generally get debt reduction, asset sales, investment attraction, smaller government, all the sort of things Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan talked about. You know, government's not the solution to the problem, it's government out of the way. You know, Conservatives like to sort of keep government out of everyone's face, run a balanced set of accounts, not too radical on social policies, you know, let things go on. But if you've got a moderate left winger of the Liberal Party running the party, like Stephen Marshall, for example, what you get is exactly what we got in those 4 years. State debt tripled, and went out and borrowed like drunken sailors, grew the size of government, got bigger, tried to jack up land taxes, diminished the Independent Commission Against Corruption, and gave us late term of abortions, and a policy point the Liberals are trying to reverse now. You may as well have the Greens in charge if you've got a moderate Liberal-led government. And a federal equivalent of that would be the difference between Malcolm Turnbull and Tony Abbott. Tony Abbott was Conservative, and you'll recall he did things very, very differently to Malcolm Turnbull, who was a moderate. And I found my direct experience was that quite often the moderates in the Liberal Party and the left-wingers in the Labor Party and the Greens would often get together on legislation. And the Conservatives in the Labor Party and the Conservatives in the Liberal Party would often get together and oppose. And whenever you had a conscience vote, you'd have all the left-wingers over one side and all the right-wingers over the other side. This is partly why Trump has tried to take the Republican Party to the Conservative side and extinguish the moderates in his party. He said, look, you people are really Democrats, go over there and be Democrats. And it might be very unwise, but it also might make things clearer for people to understand, because he's got his supporters. And similarly, the response be for the Democrats to get rid of their Conservatives and move further to the left. It might make choices clearer for people, but these are the sorts of things that go on. Anyway, the people of South Australia made their own decision on the Marshall government when it was voted out in 2022. It was the worst, I give the statistics in the book, it was the worst defeat of any Liberal government in the history of the state since World War II. The ousting of the Marshall government was that the people made their own mind up. And it wasn't the worst defeat in history, that was the Kerrin election in 2006. That was the worst defeat, but it was pretty bad. Now Labor have got their problems. A Labor government controlled by Labor's right wing, the Conservatives, for example, Mike Mann, Jay Weatherall, and the current government, Mouse's government, are very pragmatic. I used to joke with them, as I was a Conservative in a Labor cabinet. I didn't have to go to their party room meetings, I was just a cranky Conservative. And I'd say, you know, you guys are a really good Liberal government. And they'd get all frisky with me. And I mean small little Liberal, you know. Because, you know, ran balanced budgets, did things fairly responsibly, you know, had a pretty solid view of things. The sort of conversations we had were very much what I'd expect from a Liberal government. And they'd get very mad with me when I'd say that. But it's true, they balanced budgets, pro-business, not too radical on social agendas. But when Labor, now, federally, you might think Paul Keating and Bob Hawke, who were a right-wing sort of federal government. Now, when the left-wingers have got control of the Labor Party, you get a completely different outcome. Now, that's Gough Whitlam, that's the Andrews government in Victoria, and it's the current government of Queensland, where the left-wingers have got control, And debt is huge, the public sector's grown, they're losing the plot, out of control. So the point I'm making to you is the parties will tell you we stand for this, and they're terrible over there, they stand for that. What you find when you actually get inside these parties is it depends who's running the show. A Liberal Party can be a left-wing catastrophe, and so can a Labor Party, or the other way around. So you need to be very careful about believing what parties tell you about themselves when they try to define themselves. Ask yourself, is it being run by the left or run by the right? And this is exactly what's going on in America and in Europe and in Western democracy generally, and it's partly what is confusing and disappointing people, because they don't quite know. They vote for something and then they don't get it. They vote for a Liberal or Labor Party or a Conservative or Democrat, whatever, for thinking they're going to get a certain outcome, and they turn out not to get it. So neither party really gives us the truth. You'll need to look at the leaders and the factions in charge. Each can give you a government of the left or right. No wonder people are uncertain about what the major parties stand for. People are looking for new models. Some are voting for minor parties or independents. Electors want new answers and new leadership. This is going on all around the world. This is part of this. It's either part of the renewal of democracy or it's part of its demise, depending on which view you take. So why is it so in South Australia and Australia? Perhaps it's time to ask ourselves some tough questions. And I'll start to move towards the end. How much pain and suffering have we really endured as a nation in our lifetimes? No revolution to fight for our freedom. No civil war to hold our country together as in the United States or in France. It was gifted to us. Our pioneers and our grandparents were tough. Just look at the photos. When John F. Kennedy got up in America, he said in 1961, on January the 20th, to his people, think not what your country can do for you, what can you do for your country. It was 1961. Those people have lived, they lived through World War I, the Depression and World War II. And they were tough. They knew about sacrifice. When Obama came along, it was, yes, you can. You can have anything. And people aren't, this generation, we are not prepared to make the same sacrifices. We didn't suffer under the jackboot like France during World War II, occupied by a foreign power. Yet World War II gave us leaders like Menzies and Playfair. There's been no national suffering on the scale of the United States, Russia and China, or a jury anywhere in the state of Israel, or their Muslim neighbours, all of whom have suffered. Though Aboriginal communities and convicts suffered, the rest of us, as I mentioned, our history is one of having been gifted our freedom. We're one of the world's wealthiest countries thanks to mining and food, and actually people come here on boats wanting to live in poverty here. Are we a nation of victims, or are we a nation that simply sees opportunity? So a lot to do about how we value our democracy. Are we soft? Because soft times create soft leaders, and soft leaders usually make a mess of things and give us tough times. How tough is Trump? How tough is his opponent, Harris? They've both grown up in good times. No one has lived through a world war. No one's lived through a grand depression. We are generally, in Western democracies, led by people who have only known the good times. I can tell you it's not that. That's not the case in other countries. I sat down again alongside the governor of Shandong province in China, had a great chat. Where are you from, Governor? Where in Shandong were you born? He said, I wasn't, Martin. I said, I was born in Inner Mongolia. Really? Yeah. And his story was that during the Cultural Revolution, the village starved to death, basically. He, his mother, father, and 3 sisters. His father died of starvation foraging for food in the mountains behind the village. One of his sisters was on death's bed. The rest of the family narrowly survived the starvation. Hundreds of thousands of people died in the 60s during the Cultural Revolution from famine in the area where I was located, and there's trips to Shandong. He survived. They came along to his school later and identified him as a gifted student, plucked him out of there and sent him somewhere else. He got an education. When I met him, he was the governor of Shandong province. He went off to run the banking regulator in Beijing shortly after. He was younger than that. These people are tough. The Chinese leadership know what it's like to starve. They've watched their siblings die in their arms. They know what it's like to suffer. It's the same in Russia, it's the same in Turkey, and it's the same in Iran. They've known nothing but hardship. And they look at us in the West and they think we are fat, idle and weak. And that our leaders are terrible people who know nothing but the good times. And we want to be very careful because they don't bluff. They play a different game and their mind is wired differently to us. And we need to toughen up when we're dealing with these people because they have had harder lives than we have. And they believe that their systems of government that are completely non-democratic are much better than ours. And that reflects the hardship they've endured. It's a very, very interesting dynamic. So, changing our attitudes won't be easy. Donald Horne talked about this a lot. He posited the question in his great book, The Lucky Country, what makes us tick? It was a backhanded compliment. We're either incredibly smart in Australia because we're just living off mining, food and our wealth and going down the beach with the kids and buying an ice cream, as he puts it so eloquently. We're either incredibly smart, we've got the work-life balance right, or we are incredibly silly. How hungry are we to succeed? How hungry are we to be a nation that makes things? How hungry are we to take our place in the world order? How hungry are we? We don't make things anymore. We don't manufacture things anymore. If you look at the wealth of the nation, it nearly all comes from the things I just mentioned a moment ago. I'm on the Council for Australia-India Relations on behalf of the federal government. We trade a lot with India. 90% of everything we sell to India is coal or minerals. That's over 90%. The smart product and what we import from the world, all the smart stuff. We need to rethink that. The Norwegians are as wealthy as we are with natural resources. They've got one of the biggest sovereign wealth funds in the world, and they are still a manufacturing nation. So, we need to take ownership of the problem and demand better of our leaders. I talk in the book about leaders of will and leaders of ambition, because I think we need to start asking ourselves when we go to the ballot box, it's kicking the TV, isn't it? When we go to the ballot box and we look at a premier or a prime minister, what's motivating this person? And Horne helps me with this. He comes up with the term leaders of will. And he says, he calls them men of will. I've called them leaders of will. Times have changed since 1961. But those who seek power and openly enjoy it. These are leaders who establish careers by proceeding with Napoleonic determination with a canny eye for the opportunity and the ability to amass the resources and to exploit it. These leaders, says Horne, are impelled by a craving for excitement and for getting things done. Such men pioneered the nation. But in modern times, it mainly confined to business. In politics, such leaders will stake their premiership on a matter of principle. Think Whitlam. Think Abbott. Completely different politics, but completely driven men of will who wanted to change the country. Dear Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, Keating, Whitlam, Abbott, Howard, Playfair, Dunstan. But Horne goes on to foreshadow a new kind of leader, someone who is not straightforward in any way, who has learned to conceal his ambition and follows it deviously under an egalitarian guise. As tricky an individual as you are likely to encounter, in my view, they are not impelled by an appetite for achievement or desire to get things done, but a hunger for power and a need to be admired. Now, you can think of the Australian politicians that fall into that category, right? There are a couple of crackers federally, one Labor and one Liberal. And are they driven by ambition or are they driven by will? And there's another type of leader I talk about in the book. I call them leaders at the moment. They're just there having a good time. They don't really care about leaving a legacy. They don't really care about getting things done. They just like being the president or being the prime minister and their cruisers, their seat warmers. You know, is Biden a seat warmer? You know, we had one of the 6 leaders was definitely one. You have to buy the book to find out which one. And I look now very carefully about what motivates a leader. What's really driving them? Do they want to make this country a better country, or are they just there because they want to be, they're ambitious and they want to be the guy on the top? And I think it's a very important question to ask. And I delve into all these issues in the book because I think they're as important. I do it in the South Australian context, but you could take that story, you could put it in any Western democracy, and they're asking the same questions. So, I better start to wind up, because I can see the clock's moving on. There are some things that could force us to make a decision. Ukraine, I could talk to you about that if someone wants to ask a question. The Korean Peninsula, the living result of World War II. What's going on in the Middle East right now? I live there. Recognising each other's right to exist would be a very good start for a conversation. Taiwan. Would anyone in this room be happy to have a son or a grandson or granddaughter die in Taiwan, fighting to defend Taiwan? Just think about that for a minute. How important is that for us? We need to ask ourselves those questions. Politicians go on about these things. They don't bother talking to the Australian people. There could be an economic collapse, AI, artificial intelligence. We could just fall apart like Argentina did. There are a whole lot of things that could shake our democracy to its foundations. And that may force us to ask whether we want to look after it or whether we want to walk away from it. We're happy to answer questions about any of those things later. And I'll just finish on these points, getting back to the book. Our challenges are those being faced everywhere. We should aspire, at least for our children and our grandchildren, to be a country worthy of them. We should think critically but not cynically about our future potential. Vote for leaders of will, not leaders of ambition. Elect leaders who want to build a nation which stands on its own 2 feet. Look for leaders imbued with a sense of service, with a vision, a plan and a roadmap. It's a shame we rejected Houston when he came up with Fight Back, and we rejected Shorten when he came up with some very bold plans to reform our economy. You might remember negative gearing, various other things. When opposition leaders come up with anything that's bold, scare campaigns usually convince us to vote against them, and they don't get up. And that's a shame, because that delivers mediocrity. No opposition's going. You're having this in Queensland at the moment, where I think the Liberal opposition leader who's likely to win has just been very careful not to say or promise too much for fear of making a mistake or having some scare campaign against you. So you sort of go into these campaigns saying nothing, and then once you get there, you think, oh, now what will I do? You know, it's a shame we can't be bolder and more courageous. Encourage and allow some political bravery, but not recklessness from governments and oppositions. See the good, the bad and the ugly of political parties and demand that they reinvent themselves. Don't be deceived by party brands. We need reminding about how lucky we are and go back to our core values. Value freedom in all its forms and be aware that accepting rampant government interventions is the road to serfdom, as von Hayek warned us in his famous book. The more government intervenes in our life, the more other things governments are going to have to do to undo that mess. Before you know it, you're no longer a free country. But most importantly, I think, take ownership of our democracy and tend to it for fear that we lose it. Thank you for listening. Sorry if I've gone on a bit too long.